All right, hello. Thank you everybody for taking my TED Talk. My senior thesis question that I studied was, how does greenspace exposure affect child cognitive development and health? And it turns out that there is a lot. It's shocking. 90%. That is the average amount of time that most Americans will spend indoors in their life. Probably not here because we're very outside oriented, but because a lot of Americans live in cities. Cities, mostly buildings. If you're not in your house or at your cubicle, you're probably in your car, right? Mm-hmm. So you have to start to wonder, what does that do to a person? Now, a little bit of personal endeavor on how I came across this question. I always hated school as a kid. School always felt like a prison to me. You're surrounded by concrete walls, and they tell you when to go outside. And especially growing up in New Mexico, where it's all desert, there were hardly any trees. Any grass that there was dead. And you can see by the architecture of these two institutions, like this high school, it's all brick. That's actually a Supermax prison. That's not a school, but it looks like one. That's ADX Florence. That's where they keep all the notorious terrorists.
Oh.
Yep. So coming to Durango was an entirely different experience for me because there were large windows, even in the elementary schools, large windows where you could look outside and you could see the lawns and the large cottonwood trees and the small creeks. And that was just so much better for me, as that stimulation helped my brain, as I have attention deficit disorder. And it's just, trees are good. Like, I guess that's kind of the point I'm getting across. Now, what is green space? Green space is an area of grass, trees, or other vegetation that is set aside for aesthetic or recreation purposes in an otherwise urban environment. And we specify an urban environment because a farmer's field is a green space, but it kind of works differently, as I will explain later. So this is in London, and London was kind of the first to modernize the green space. The history of green space goes back to ancient Rome. This is a villa in ancient Rome for the rich. And they specifically underlined the term rus and urb, which means nature in city, along the lines. Ancient Rome is a hard language, but especially in the wealthier communities, they had parks, pools, fruit trees, and community gardens, and canals. Now, London took this, and in a book published named The London Square, the book was actually published in the 21st century, scientists highlighted the importance of this for the people, as London in the 19th century was very polluted, very dismal. People died a lot of dysentery and tuberculosis. And these green spaces they implemented, these large fields, helped a lot. And they were kind of the first in the modern age to coin this and its importance, even though across many societies it was valued. So the main couple topics I studied were green space exposure and its effect on child cognitive development. Now this, I believe, is Ghana. And this is an outdoor classroom they implemented outside of their school for the purpose of giving a better learning environment, as in a lot of poorer countries, education is valued so much more. And it is very important to them that they try to get the most out of their education for a kid. The second important topic was the art of Shinrin-yoku. Shinrin-yoku is a term that was coined by the Ministry of Defense in the 1860s and is the art of taking in the forest atmosphere. Now, along with forest, it is also used as a term to describe Zen gardens and fisheries. Any place where you could have this connection to nature, as Japanese culture is heavily embedded in the art of Zen and meditation. And the next topic I glazed over, and this was a very difficult one, as children are very unpredictable, was green space and child health. Now, this kind of delved into accessibility of green space and how that accessibility can alter how greatly it is used, but it was kind of just sprawled out into such a wide and broad topic. I tried to keep it as narrow as child health and how accessible green space can benefit the physical health of a child. So, and then I guess kind of the fourth topic that I lumped in with the third was the urban planning, implementing green space as in a green space. In urban, green space is a lot more effective in a physical health aspect than a rural green space, as they find in studies that people who have to drive to a park, in that park will often perform better physically. They will get more exercise. They will leave healthier than a kid who lives on a farm and can run around all the time. They find that people who have less access will use it greater as they treasure it better. Now, going into my research, the common knowledge with the research of this topic is that green is good. It does good things to people. You just have to figure out how it does good, why it's good, and how it can be properly implemented. So the first kind of study I based my knowledge off for the cognitive development of a child was the Breathe study in Barcelona. Now, what they did is, because Barcelona is fairly urban and tight-packed, was they looked at schools in urban areas, suburban areas, and more secluded areas closer to nature. Now, how this was measured is kind of a bias because they used NDVI, or Normalized Difference Vegetation Index, where they used an infrared satellite scan to show any area that had green. Now this could be, it couldn't even be a park, it could just be trees that were closed off or a field, and that's kind of where the issue comes in on accessibility. But for exposure, they found that if the school is next to trees, next to nature, if your home is next to a wooded area, you will perform significantly higher on a cognitive stimulation test. And this, the main factor for this was air pollution. Air pollution is bad for you, it turns out. So kids that lived in urban areas and drove to school, and their schools were in downtown Barcelona, did not perform as well, as they had overall worse health. But kids who lived out in these natural areas performed way better, and their cognitive steeply grew as they grew older. So their development, the development of the urban kids was halted significantly. Like, that's concerning. For the next study, I looked into the physical attributes, and for this, the studies of Shinrin-yoku was probably the best fitted. This experiment was to take cities, residents of Tokyo, Kyoto, and other villages, and to, for 15 minutes a day, place them in a forest environment. And then they would take them out of that forest environment, place them in a city environment. And then the next day, they would show them pictures of each environment. And what they found was that after spending 15 minutes in a forest environment, your pulse rates would be significantly lower. Your salivary cortisol, which is a stress hormone, was also significantly lower, even just in the city area too. So the main kind of contradicting point with this study was that even being outside, not in a urban environment, was helpful. So if you were to just step outside your office onto the street for 15 minutes, it would help. But if you were to step outside into a forest for 15 minutes, the effect would be drastically better. Along with that was blood pressure. If in a forest area, your blood pressure would be lower, in a city area, your blood pressure would always also be lower, but less. So for diastolic and systolic blood pressure, both would lower, which is, for your heart, extremely good, especially in the United States, where there is a growing obesity epidemic, and a majority of adults will die from heart issues. These should be taken into consideration. What this means. So now that we have the definitive proof that a green space is good, how do you implement this? So you have to think about, well, it's good, We know that green space is good. So we have to think, okay, how can we implement this? And now at Animus, we got pinyon forest out there. We got grass fields out there. So we know that even this exposure is great. Now, Durango already has amazing air quality. So in an urban environment, how can we fit a space like that into a city block? Whether that's elevated gardens, rooftop gardens, or in Athens, a walkable community that is covered with shade. And the Europeans are a lot better at doing that because their cities are so old that those features are already present. But if you go to Dallas, where's the trees? Oh, we didn't build any. From the civil perspective of green space, and this is where it kind of gets a little complicated, is lower albedo. So the physical air temperature of your city gets cooler because the trees provide more shade and the green reflects a lot of sunlight. So your cities are cooler, your air is healthier, your water quality is cleaner, there is less crime, and there is less, is a tighter knit community. Now, on crime, this was kind of hard, is a lot of societal instances are taking into effect. Socioeconomic factors like poverty, political alignment. And they find that in the poor areas, there is still crime, but there is less than if it was not as green. So that was the main issue coming up through these studies, is that people who were poorer had less access to green space, had less access to clean air, still faltered heavily, but people who lived in these urban environments and had to drive to access this green space used it heavily more often and treasured it more and got more out of it than people who lived right next to it. So that's kind of where the issue comes in, is where if you have this green space right outside your house, you're not going to pay much mind to it and it may not be used as well as effectively. But if you have to drive 30 minutes to the park, you're going to kind of eat that up more. And that's because that's kind of where the issue arises, because this is a money pit. You have to water this, you have to fertilize it, you have to pay somebody to go out and trim it. And if it's not being used, it's not being taken for granted as heavily by these people, it's going to be a waste of money. And there's nothing politicians hate more than wasting money. Wasting money on things they don't care about. So you have to think, is it worth the effort? You have to take into account all these factors on socioeconomic stability and who's living there and who's accessing it and how well it's being accessed. There's a lot of research you have to do to probably implement something like this so it can benefit children in a proper way. In an urban area, it is best implemented because these children have this, it's almost special that you have this green space that they can go to be healthier and benefit off of, instead of an urban space where it's just cornfields for 1,000 miles. And while it is still providing those benefits, it's not going to be taken as granted. So on the civil and political side, it's very hard to convince these people that they need to give you $3 million to build this, because the people that are already there and already have access to this are not going to take it and use it as heavily as people who do not. So the issue is it's all about how much it really matters to you and how much it's going to matter to your kids on how, you know, do you want your kids to grow up and be cognitively altered? Because the way the trends are going, do you want your kids to be stupid? I guess that's the question I'm trying to ask.
Maybe.
Because if we do not, as a collective, make a change, if we do not take action in a political stance, in a community stance, this is a concerning trend that will continue to happen all across America, England, places like India. Especially if people don't really care enough, we will have the already rising obesity epidemic is just going to get worse. And it has to be taken care of. That's the main issue, is it has to be taken care of. If a city park goes to waste, it becomes dangerous. I guess an example of this is the Kandahar slums disaster near Burma. The government approved a very large grant to build a kind of like a park, an artificial green space near these slums, as the belief that very high crime rate could help be lowered and it could create a tighter knit community aspect. And some engineering screw up led to poisonous backflow into the green space and killed everything, and then everything that was already there. And then crime only started going up, and it got even considerably worse. So you have to convince a bunch of people that this is going to be good for them when they live in their cookie-cutter house and suburb. So at the end of the day, you gotta ask yourself, should I go touch grass? Thank you all so much.